If this was the top and diminishing returns are expected, what sort of top could we expect in the next cycle? You previously spoke about the long-term holders trending upwards. Is this still the case? Yes, it very much depends on what kind of measure you use for the long-term holding. The number of wallets that hold at least one Bitcoin tended to stop growing after the ETF launch, unfortunately. When we look at the holders that have traded Bitcoin within the last 180 days, they're actually slightly buying right now. So you can see the purchases over here. There are a few purchases, but they're not as aggressive compared to prior dips, right? In prior dips, the long-term holders tended to buy more aggressively. Now the buying is a bit more muted. And so those purchases, I believe, aren't enough to create a real turnaround. If you look at the very, very long term, so let's say the HODL waves, right? So how much of Bitcoin is held by different holder categories, and you look at this in terms of years, not just in terms of a few weeks, then of course there's more and more Bitcoin, relatively speaking, that hasn't moved for the last 10 years. There's more and more Bitcoin that hasn't moved for the last 7 years. There's also more and more Bitcoin over time that hasn't moved for the last 5 years. And this is what I like about this chart. Actually, it shows us at what particular time frame does this flip. So when do we turn from a long-term investor to somebody that tries to just ride the markets, that has to time the market? The cutoff, interestingly enough, is at the 3 to 5 year mark. So if you do not hold Bitcoin for at least 5 years, you have to expect some volatility. So all the wallets that hold Bitcoin for 3 years, right, they tend to sell off during a rally. So when Bitcoin is going up, those kinds of wallets sell. When Bitcoin is going up, those kind of wallets take some profit. And they're also taking profit recently, right? They're still taking profit. Not that much anymore in the last few weeks, but in general, right, they tend to rather offload. If your time horizon is longer than 5 years, then you can ignore the cycles. If your time horizon is shorter than 5 years, then of course you do want to be a bit more careful, and you want to make sure that you take advantage of our on-chain metrics. Hope that's useful, right? In case you haven't yet seen this HODL wave, I think it's quite nice to see that over the very, very long term, the liquid supply is contracting. The long-term holders, as a percent of all of Bitcoin circulating supply, tend to hold more and more Bitcoin over time. And that then means that, of course, Bitcoin has to at least outperform the fiat debasement, right? Fiat currency debases by roughly 6.8% per annum. So that's the minimum growth rate of Bitcoin. It's the growth rate of the prices of the S&P 500. And I do expect the same at least for Bitcoin, but probably the outperformance will be more than that because the liquid supply tends to contract over time, because Bitcoin gets lost. Bitcoin gets stacked away by the very long-term holders that hold Bitcoin for at least 5 years. And so because of that, 7% per annum is the minimum. It's probably going to outperform. But also the Nasdaq 100 tends to outperform long term. So then it's the big question, right? What's really risk adjusted, the better bet?